שלום לכולם, אנחנו בפרק השלישי של שאלה של טרמינולוגיה. הניסיון שלנו לעזור לכם להדריך באנגלית טובה יותר, ברורה יותר. היום נמצאים איתנו שניים, אבי בן חור, רכז קורסי מורי דרך לשעבר, מרצה בכיר בקורסי מורי הדרך בהווה, שידבר איתנו על המקום הקדוש ביהדות, איך מתייחסים למקום התפילה, ביהדות ברמה של טרמינולוגיה, ונמצא איתנו גם האב אנטוני, שהוא מרצה בכיר, פרופסור ללימודי ברית חדשה באקול ביבליק, והוא ייתן לנו את הפרספקטיבה לכנסיות, פרספקטיבה הלשונית לשאלת הלשונות. אז בוקר טוב אבי, תן לי באנגלית, איך מתייחסים לבתי תפילה ביהדות?
Okay, good morning everybody. So I'm going to speak now in terms of the 21st century. And I would say that generally speaking, if I were to divide the main Jewish denominations to Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox, so the Reform would typically call it a temple, the Conservative Jews would call it a synagogue, and Orthodox would call it a shul. Ultra-Orthodox very often pray in something called a shtibel, okay, which actually is kind of like a private home synagogue, kind of smells a little bit like a domus ecclesia, okay, but it's not, but it's very typical to small communities, considered more intimate, and very often is also associated with Hasidic Jews. So we have temple for Reform, synagogue for conservative Jews, and shul for Orthodox, and let's say shtibel for some ultra-Orthodox.
Perfect. Thank you, Avi. Now, Father Anthony, with the world of the Christian holy places, there is so much that we can consider as places of worship, but we need different terms. Maybe we can begin by describing what is the meaning and when do you use the words sanctuary and shrine. When we look at guides, guidebooks, we hear that there are lots of sanctuaries in the land or lots of shrines. So why don't we use churches? Why do we use sanctuaries or shrines?
You could use church. It's not incorrect. Church is probably the biggest overarching term that we have. But a sanctuary or a shrine is very specifically connected with a pilgrim destination. So a shrine is the technical term. A sanctuary is a wider kind of colloquial term that's almost equivalent, but it will be a place where people come to practice some sort of popular piety, or maybe a church that commemorates a particular event or mystery of the faith or something like that, which is very frequently the case here in Israel.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Tell us something about sanctuary inside a church.
Right. So sanctuary has this other sense as well, that in the interior of a church, it's the kind of sacred center of the action. So it's where the liturgical action principally takes place. Usually inside of a church, you'll have a place for the laity and a place where the priest or the choir, liturgical performers, let's call them, are centered. There often be a divider of some sort in a Greek or an Orthodox church would be an iconostasis, and behind that would be the sanctuary. So the Holy of Holies, technically it's from the old temple construction, but the holiest section where the Blessed Sacrament would be reserved. And it's a place where pilgrims shouldn't be wandering around. It's a place reserved to the holiest action.
Very important. So when we say that we go to see a sanctuary, it's very good. But then when we are in the sanctuary, there's the sanctuary that we should not step inside.
That's right.
Perfect. אבי, רק תגיד לי במילה אחת, האם אתה משתמש במילה sanctuary לאתרים יהודיים?
So I think that one can use the term shrine in Judaism, specifically for non-Jewish audience. I mean, we would say, you would go on pilgrimage to Rachel's tomb. You wouldn't necessarily call it a shrine. For Jews, you wouldn't use that terminology, but for a non-Jewish group you're guiding in a Jewish site, you can certainly use the term shrine. You're not doing anything wrong, and you're basically bringing them into a certain mindset, because it's the same concept of pilgrimage to get to a site which is designated specifically for pilgrimage for worship. And I think it's very common to the Abrahamic faiths.
Okay. I'd like to discuss the word church. Perhaps this is the broadest term that covers all places of worship and pilgrimage. בעברית אני אומר שהמילה church בכלל מקורה במילה היוונית קיריאקוס. קיריוס זה אלוהים, והמקום של אלוהים היה קיריאקוס, ומזה התגלגלה המילה קירקה או קירשה או church. שפות אחרות כמו הצרפתית, ספרדית, מכירות את המילה איגלסיה או איגליז, שזה מאקלזיה, התכנסות. So whether it is for the public together or it is the place to worship God, Father Anthony, when are we using the word church? Is it possible to use it for every place of worship?
Almost. It is a very, very broad term, but the key idea here is when it refers to a building, it's a public building of divine worship, which will be different than when we talk about a chapel. So it's open to lay people to come and pray. Masses are celebrated there publicly, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. And this is a term that is acceptable to all denominations, to all groups. It can be the most radical Protestant group, but the word church, because it stems from the place of God, of worshiping God, is possible. Even in open space, is there a place where people can worship which is under the sky?
I mean, you wouldn't call it a church if it's not an enclosed structure. So sometimes you have these outdoor altars and so forth. And in that case, you would usually, so like Mount of Beatitudes or something, you have what you might call little outdoor sanctuaries or something like this, but those are certainly not churches. The church has to be an enclosed structure.
Mm-hmm. And I'm speaking about the unique type of church called basilica. When we're taught that the Byzantine world started with developing a certain architecture that was based on the Roman basilica, we usually think of a basilica as a Byzantine archaeological structure. But in reality, we know that there are churches, especially in the Catholic world, that are termed basilica. So what does that mean exactly?
It's a mark of honor. So there's a kind of ranking of precedence of churches. I mean, the very highest church of all is the only archbasilica. That's the Pope's church, which is actually St. John Lateran, not St. Peter's. And then you have these kind of descending ranks. Here in Israel, we have 4 what are called major basilicas, which would be in Nazareth, Mount Tabor, Gethsemane, and the Holy Sepulchre, which we don't often call it a basilica, but it is actually a major basilica. And then we also have minor basilicas. And the difference between those two would be that connected with a major basilica is actually not just an honorary church that has certain privileges and rights, but also certain people who have privileges and rights, and those are usually called canons. So, for instance, the president of France is a canon of the Basilica of the Holy Sepulchre. There's a lot of others, but the minor basilicas wouldn't have those communities attached to them. But both major and minor basilicas would have the insignia of a basilica, which is a bell, like the church bell that you ring, and an umbrella, an ombrellino, kind of a parasol, which is like the roof of a building, but you would have a red and yellow umbrella and a bell inside any basilica.
So a Catholic that enters such a church and realizes that there's this insignia, so that pilgrim will feel that there's a greater benefit in praying in this place?
There's usually connected with a basilica certain indulgences that are available. So yes, that's usually the case. You can have these connected also with shrines and other things, so it's not exclusive, but the character of a basilica is distinct and it's elevated. It also has to do, honestly, when you have a giant liturgical procession, You have to know where everyone stands. The people connected with the basilica get to go in a, in a more important place than the people from another kind of church. So it's these kinds of rankings that are implicated.
Mm-hmm. That are very specific to the Catholic world. And if we're guiding Protestants or others, and we happen to step into such churches, we want to explain that this is part of a tradition typical to the Catholic Church. Now, what about cathedral? The word cathedral comes from, again, the Greek language, so it should have been a term used by all Christian groups. Protestants don't use cathedral so much, but still there's in England the cathedral of St. Paul and other places. So what is really a cathedral, and what is the Cathedral of Jerusalem?
So you would have Protestant groups as well as Catholic and Orthodox. If they have bishops, they have cathedrals. So a cathedral is connected, is the church of a bishop. That's the simplest thing. It's cathedra is his seat, it's his throne. And so it's the church built around his throne. Because there's only one bishop, at least to a denomination, in any given region, there's normally only one cathedral. Sometimes because of historical circumstances, there can be two, and this is the case here in Jerusalem. You have the exceptional circumstance of having the Holy Sepulchre. So for instance, the Latin Patriarch has a co-cathedral, which means that's where the Latin Patriarch, the bishop of the Latin Catholics, has his kind of personal church, okay? But at the same time, he's the patriarch of that other half of the co-cathedral, which is the Holy Sepulchre. So a cathedral is a bishop's church. Normally there's just one, but here you have two.
Father Anthony, the word chapel. Now, this is a little bit of a confusing term, because usually we think of a chapel as a very small place. And by the way, it has a very interesting history. The word itself, chapel, comes from kappa. Can you tell us about this?
I think there's two possibilities. The one that comes into English through the French chapelle, and there's the thought that it actually comes from a shrine, a pilgrim site, where the cape, the kappa of Saint Martin of Tours was kept as a relic. So it might be from that. It might also refer to a little bit like the ombrellino, this umbrella I talked about from the basilica, the cape, a piece of canvas that was held over an altar, but not entirely sure the origin, one or the other probably.
Okay, now chapel sounds to us like a small church. Is it true? When I see the Church of Dominus Flevit on Mount of Olives, should I call it a chapel or a church?
Again, I mean, just talking to people on the street, you can call it either. It is a chapel. It is also more technically a church. The distinction, back to what I said at churches technically, is between public and private, not between big and small. So you can have very tiny churches and very large chapels, and we have that. The two terms can be, interchanged quite a bit, but technically a chapel is the private place of worship for individuals or groups. So often religious order will have chapels or something. In the Holy Sepulchre, we have these radial chapels around and apse, and this goes back. Those are shrines in the sense they commemorate little things, and there's many pilgrimages that go to each of these, but they're chapels in the sense that traditionally they're actually places of private mass. So you would have what are called private altars. There's a small altar, not for the grand public worship where the whole community gathers, but for private celebrations. So that's why those are chapels.
So with chapels, we have to be more careful, because if they are privately owned, for example, if it is a chapel of a monastery, then we should ask the permission, unlike with public churches that are open for all.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Okay, and it also means that the chapel must have an altar. It's impossible to have a chapel without an altar?
In a Catholic context, it will always have an altar because it will be a place that's actually consecrated for divine worship, and that means there will be mass celebrated on an altar.
Mm-hmm. All right, so what is the difference between a chapel and an oratory? A word that we don't use so much in guiding here in the Holy Land. There are many more examples of oratories around the world, but still, what is an oratory?
In canon law, so speaking very technically, they're actually the same. So you would have this public-private distinction. Frequently, however, an oratory isn't connected with an altar. So an oratory, I mean, etymologically is a place of prayer, which might not be liturgical prayer, it might be private prayer. So you might not have a mass, you might not have an altar, but you can have oratories that are chapels that have altars as well. But that even more specific designation of a little hall in which you pray, that would be an oratory, at least in Catholic parlance.
Mm-hmm. I think we will finish here, and you'll just say that the entire Holy Land seems to be a very big oratory. You can have also chapels and prayers and altars and commemoration spots, but in general, this entire land is covered with places of connection to God. And just when we guide our pilgrims, we should be just more careful to use the terms, because especially if they come from a Catholic background, they would prefer to have the accurate terminology. So thank you very much, Father Anthony.
Thank you, thank you.
אבי בן חור, תודה רבה כמו תמיד.
בבקשה.
תודה לכולם ובהצלחה בהדרכות שלכם.